welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. Maybe we should get started right at 7, the hallmark of a Center for Research on Vermont event. Really great talk tonight, but before I introduce our two panelists, I'm Richard Watts, the director of the Center for Research on Vermont, and if you haven't looked at our website lately, you can see all sorts of things that we're up to, including short videos with prominent UVM and Vermont researchers that are catchy and kind of interesting. But mostly, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of events that are upcoming. One, the third in our Research in Progress seminar series is April 15th with a professor here in the College of Medicine who uses very large databases to be able to say things about the kinds of health care people might need. And the information is become of national interest. So that's work that's being done here at UVM also. And then on May 7th is our annual meeting, the center's annual meeting. There's a dinner. If you want to go to the dinner, send me a note. And there are some Vermont researchers who are editing a book with 18 sections on various things that are happening in Vermont that they think say something unusual, something unique about what Vermont's doing. So that's on May 7th. So students, you're still around. Come on by. By the way, you may not know, but I teach a course called Introduction to Vermont, which is about Vermont research. And nice to see some of you guys here, and also the sustainable transportation students. So, of interest to you guys, two things. Just make sure you're aware of both of these. One is that we have an award that we give for students doing summer research, and the deadline is April 11th. And you can read more about it on our website. And any of you who have been working away on a paper for the semester or it's your thesis, submit it and you have a chance to win $250 and this very prestigious award that's been around here at UVM for 20 or so years, named in honor of these two faculty who are longtime faculty members. So, lots of time on that, April 24th. All right, tonight, Brian Lee, Meghan Cope. Brian is, one last thing. Sign up list. Please, add your name. We're very discreet with how we use this for center events, and it's a great way for us to know you're here. I should say that tonight's talk is co-sponsored by the Transportation Research Center. And I see several members of the Transportation Research Center, including the Associate Director, Glenn McCrae, and the Director of the Center for Research on Vermont Board, Margaret Tamilonis, and also, of course, the Department of Geography, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. So, tonight, Teens, Technology, and Transportation, a Vermont case study. Brian Lee is an assistant professor in the College of Engineering and Math Sciences. He completed his PhD at the University of Washington, Seattle. Everybody here wants to move to Seattle. And his areas of expertise include transportation, land use modeling, non-motorized transportation planning, and safety and policy evaluation. Brian's been here at UVM since 2012? 9. Wow. And he teaches some fabulous courses on transportation, land use modeling, traffic calming design, and bike and pedestrian planning. Meghan Cope is the professor in geography and chair of the Department of Geography. Her research interests include urban social geography, children's geographies, gender, race, ethnicity, North American cities, and social theory. And among courses that she teaches are geographies of youth, urban geography, space, place, and society. So I'm going to welcome the two presenters to come up here, and they have worked out how they're going to go back and forth a bit. And so I really appreciate Meghan and Brian being here tonight in their talk, Teens, Technology, and Transportation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're going to start with just a really brief introduction of our interests, although we didn't realize how much Richard was going to say about our backgrounds and our interests. So, but this is really as a way to frame this project. So, as Richard mentioned, I am interested in, I also teach courses in youth geographies, and a lot of what that means is that we in this field study the ways that young people interact in space, how young people actually produce interesting social spaces in and of their own right, and also the special kinds of constraints or opportunities that might face young people as they move from, say, domestic space into public spaces, as they travel across the routes that they take in a daily basis, say from home to work or home to school. And so I just wanted to kind of introduce that idea of youth geographies because it sounds a little odd to people who aren't in the discipline. And my background is really in urban research, but this represents kind of a new stretch for me out into the somewhat suburban, almost rural sprawl type landscape. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'm going to turn this over to Brian. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself and then introduce our topic and how we came to this work.
Thanks, Meghan. So part of this is we wanted to explain to you why an engineer would be collaborating with a geographer. I'm not going to be talking about a big dam that we're trying to build or some big structures, but a big part of my background has been on the relationships between the built environment and basically how people travel in space. And that's useful, except that there's a lot of focus on specific areas within that domain. There's a lot of focus on people traveling to work, and which is mostly about adults. The youth part and a lot of the other types of trips are not as well studied. And when Meghan and I started talking, from the very beginning when I first got here, we kind of realized that there's common interest here, looking at people who are challenged in terms of having transportation and their abilities to move around if you're either not able to drive or do things that adults do, which, this teen population is a very good example of that. And kind of just to mention that this was this is a piece of exploratory research that's ongoing right now, and we're still doing the analysis and writing this up. So any kind of feedback that we receive from tonight would be really helpful. So when you think of these three words, teens, technology, and transportation, can I just ask the audience, what do you think of when you hear those three words? Anyone?
Texting and driving.
Texting and driving. I did not plant that, but that's very popular. When you put those three together, the intersection of those three, we're not going to be talking about that very popular piece, the safety part of it. We think it's very important, but there's a lot of attention focused on that when you think about teens and technology and kind of traveling around. But I do want to point out a number of things that is in the public discourse, the popular media, that's non-safety related per se, but relates directly to what we're talking about. Yeah. Got it. Trigger happy here. So, there are two things that in the public discourse that's of interest to us. One is mobility, and the other is travel behavior. When we're thinking of mobility, there's talk of this smartphone being the new rite of passage. If we think about my generation or previous generations, the popular rite of passage would be getting your license at 16 and at some point getting a car and being liberated with that freedom. If you read the media now, the focus, you would think that everybody, all they care about is having a smartphone. And in the challenging times that we've been living in, there's been discussions about teens making that choice that if they can't have their own car, or even if they are not focused on getting a license at 16, that maybe they're much more focused on getting a smartphone so that even if they can't get places physically, that may be able to reach out and connect with their peers virtually. I have to know which way to go. So, and then that makes a lot of businesses, specifically the automobile industry, really kind of nervous. This talk about young people who are choosing this virtual connection versus physical connection. All the big automobile makers are saying that they're projecting young people to not be adopting vehicles, and they're trying to figure out how to make up for that market share and being really nervous about that. And then secondly, as far as behavior is concerned, there's certainly national data that talks about teenagers delaying their licensure, that they're not rushing out when they're 16 or depending on the state that they live in, whenever they're available to get that driver's license. And this idea of this digital generation that's waiting. And what that translates to, a lot of hypotheses around, and there's some anecdotal data and some national data that says, okay, the amount of driving may be plateauing, that we're not increasing, particularly for the younger generations, that maybe they're opting for other types of transportation modes. And when you dig into some of the popular media and look at the references that they make, there's not a lot of hard data, and some of them may be contradictory. And bringing it back to Vermont, what we were also interested in is that happening here? Are people, are teenagers here waiting to get their license? Are people here driving less? And what are the circumstances behind that?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about our research questions and how we framed this project. The first question that we came up with that seemed quite obvious as an overlap between our work was thinking about the different contexts that people live in and that are present in this area. And by context, we're in this instance looking really at the combinations of land use patterns. So how dense are the houses together? What is the street network? What kinds of alternate transportation is available? Are there buses? Are there sidewalks? And so forth. And then also the transportation decisions that go on and create a certain set of infrastructure and opportunities for everyone. But in our particular interest, we're focusing on young people. So we were interested in how, there's been a lot of work done on urban young people and how those contexts influence their daily lives. And there's been some work on rural young people and how those kinds of contexts of density and infrastructure and so forth influence their lives. Very little has been done on more suburban populations. So this was an opportunity for us to look very locally and to identify a couple of key themes that we were interested in. It also gives us the opportunity to somewhat to fill a gap in the literature. So not only are suburban locations somewhat less examined in general land use and transportation literature, but also a lot of that is dominated by things like the journey to work among adults. So the Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics and other institutions, the Department of Transportation, for instance, create enormous numbers of data on how adults get to work, but very little on how teens get to high school. Now, another focus you may have heard of is Safe Routes to School. So there's a national organization on Safe Routes to School that does some research on how usually K through 8 kids get to school. Are they driven by their parents? Do they walk, bike? Do they take the school bus, city bus, et cetera? The teens, in a lot of ways, are kind of a gap. And so we thought this between the suburban focus and looking at land use settings in that realm, as well as the youth focus, the teen focus, that we would be providing some context that was somewhat absent in the literature. The second research question that we developed is around looking specifically from the perspective of teens. How do they frame the ways that they navigate, move around, and sort of negotiate their daily lives? How do they get access to different kinds of spaces that they want to go to, whether it's the mall or movies or a friend's house or get to soccer practice or to their part-time job or even to school? So how do they make all those sets of decisions that result in them actually showing up on time or getting together with their friends or whatever the sort of destination and the desired outcome is? The third research question is a little bit more abstract, and this really emerged while we started doing the research. So we started out looking at land use and transportation and looking at mobility among teens and how they access different locations in their daily lives. And we realized very quickly that everything seemed to hinge on communication. So the ability to communicate with those friends who are meeting at the movie theater or dad who's going to pick you up from soccer practice and give you a ride home, that was incredibly important. So luckily we figured this out just before our survey went out, and we put some questions in about cell phone ownership and use and how that might influence the ways that people organize their daily lives. In a more abstract way, this comes from an interest in an emerging idea of young people constructing and negotiating their own, what we might call, digital lives. So this is not in digital lives in the sense of like how much time do you spend in front of the screen, but rather how do digital technologies help you achieve the things you need to do on a daily basis? How do they help you get from A to B? How do they help you let somebody know that you need a ride? And so obviously we're mostly interested in the pieces that have to do with transportation. There's a whole bunch of other things you could talk about as far as digital lives go. But that was kind of the more abstract end of our research questions. I'll just say one final thing about our kind of framing of this research, which is that one of the initial questions and concerns that arose was a sense that with more car-oriented development, particularly in suburban settings, so places where it's really hard to get around without a car, places that don't have sidewalks, that have busy, higher speed roads, that have long distances between key destinations. Those kinds of places could be said to be spatially isolating for certain populations, those populations who don't drive. So that could be lots of other groups as well as teens, pre-driving teens. Obviously children, some of the elderly, some people who are disabled, some people who are low income or otherwise opt out of driving. So we had a sense that these spatial organizations of car-oriented suburbs were potentially spatially isolating for our subject population of teens. And the flip side to that was that, so we have on one hand spatial isolation, but on the flip side, we also have this situation where because people are getting their license quite early and are getting access to cars in some of these settings, which we'll show you in a minute, they suddenly are transformed into a sort of hypermobility. So you could envision then this situation where teens are growing up in a subdivision or somewhere where they can maybe get to a couple friends' houses by walking, but not a whole lot of other places. So can they go to the movies? Can they go and buy their favorite popsicle or whatever it is, right? By walking and cycling and other means of transportation? No. But then they get a car and they're sort of launched into this very high level of independent mobility, which is really in contrast to that growing up in quite relative spatial isolation. Okay, so that contrast, I think, really informed a lot of our research questions here. Okay, so the study this is like the big reveal here, right? Like, where did we do this? And these are the two school districts that we chose to work with. This involved some amount of research to try and identify two school districts that had enough in common so that we could kind of compare them, but also had some distinct differences. And those of you who are local and perhaps even went to one of these high schools will know that this is South Burlington High School on the left and Champlain Valley Union on the right, which is in Heinsberg. So I'll tell you a little bit about this. I won't assume that everybody knows everything about these high schools. Basically, they have similar student population sizes. They're both just under 1,000 students. The demographics are quite similar in terms of race and ethnicity characteristics. They're quite similar in terms of household income. And I should mention that both sets of population are quite high household income, both compared to Vermont and nationally. And Brian will tell you a little bit more about that. And let's see, and then some differences include, first of all, that obviously South Burlington High School serves South Burlington, although there are some school choice students there as well who come from like the islands and so forth. Whereas CVU is a regional school, so it serves Williston, Shelburne, Charlotte, Heinsberg, and obviously St. George. Don't forget St. George. So that is quite inherently a difference. The geographic footprint of each school district is pretty different. There's also quite a lot of difference in terms of the immediate setting of the high school. So this was another part of our choice and why we decided to use these two high schools. So South Burlington High School, if you have been there, is on Dorset Street in South Burlington. It's less than a mile from the University Mall. It's very close to apparently Al's French fries. There's a shortcut. There are a lot of amenities that are very popular among teens, fairly close by and easily reachable. So the immediate setting of the high school is quite attractive in terms of a lot of those destinations. It's also part of a community that has a pretty well-served public bus system and school busing as well. There is a good network of sidewalks and bike paths through a lot of the community, and it's a fairly dense community. So obviously there are pockets of South Burlington that are lower density, a little bit more subdivision style, but quite a bit of South Burlington is characterized by a higher density housing pattern, which creates a sort of efficiency and a level of connectivity that we don't really see in the other school district, which is, again, CVU. So CVU, obviously being 4 towns plus St. George, is quite diverse in its characteristics, its residential characteristics. There are some denser pockets within Williston and Shelburne Village and so forth. But overall, the density is much lower for housing. The potential connectivity between households or between homes and desired destinations is much less. And the distances, of course, are very long. So I had a babysitter who went to CVU, and she lived in Williston, but her best friend lived in Charlotte, so it took her 40 minutes to get to her friend's house. And she actually had her own car. So you can see that it's quite a different set of land use and transportation context that we're looking at. Okay, so that's the research setting, and I'll just give you a really quick overview of the methodology that we used, and then I'll let Brian tell you a little bit about our initial findings. So in October of 2011, we designed an online survey. There was an optional paper component for some parents if they wanted to do that. But basically it was a paired survey where parents would be given a link to an online survey. They would answer some household-based questions and also questions about the sort of modes of travel that they commonly use. Is there a bus stop nearby? What kinds of household negotiations they engage with about travel among the household members, and also employment data, some income and education levels and those kinds of things. Then the second part of it was that they were asked to give permission for their teens to participate in our teen survey. The teen survey then, and as I said, Brian will give you the details, but then asked a lot of questions about their prime destinations, were they able to get to places they wanted to go, other kinds of teen-related questions and issues that were important, things like school travel, sports, part-time jobs, friendship networks, those kinds of things. So these surveys took place in the fall of 2011. And then in the spring of 2012, about 6 months later, we did a half-day workshop with 5 teens from both schools that involved some more intensive qualitative research to follow up on the survey, but also really to contextualize it and try to identify some of the other key insights that we were starting to see from the survey. And I'll tell you more about the qualitative research in a few minutes after Brian does his piece.
So Meghan mentioned that we started off with this idea of the pair survey. And this is relatively unique in the transportation research kind of arena. A lot of the surveys that we do are primarily focused on one person of the household or providing information about what the entire household might have done, but really from maybe one or a person's perspective. We were doing this for a couple of reasons because of the permission aspects that we weren't able to really access to teens without getting permissions from the parents to begin with. But we also wanted to triangulate some information and ask sort of questions to both audience and see if there are differences in perspectives, especially regarding some of the negotiation that goes on. A number of things that, in addition to the things that Meghan mentioned, it was from the parents that we found out where they lived and some of the perceived household information about their surrounding environments. What kind of built environments they have, whether they know that there's a bus stop or not, what kind of supportive infrastructure for biking and walking, basically non-motorized vehicle type of transportation. And then for the teens, we asked specific things about the teens, like if they have a license, when they get their license, or if they haven't gotten a license yet, when do they wish that they will have a license, or when they expect to do that. So various information from both perspectives, and trying to get at the intra-household dynamics between the parents or the guardians and the teen members. So as Meghan mentioned, the total population of the two schools, approximately 2,000, and out of those, we got about just over 250 parents who filled out the parents part of the survey, and they were roughly equal between the two schools. As far as, then there's some attrition that goes on because these parents provided permission for the teens to do the survey, and then not every teen that got permission did the survey. So we ended up with just under 150 teens who got permission and actually did the survey. The household that we ended up getting within our sample was definitely skewed towards high income and highly educated households. We kind of call these resource-rich households. They were comparing to the county for Chittenden County. They were definitely in the. We got almost 2/3 of the households that in the over $100,000 annual income range. Vast majority, about 4/5 of them, have at least a bachelor's degree or higher within the household. And over 90% of them own their own home and have at least 2 vehicles. And what was also interesting was that there were no households that we surveyed that didn't have any vehicles. And at first, when we got these, or as these survey results were coming in, we were a little nervous about this not being representative. And part of doing survey is that we wanted to get a variety of households so that we can make some insights into the population that we're studying. The silver lining behind this is that we started thinking about, well, if we got a sample of these really resource-rich people, and these are people who are able to purchase a 3rd vehicle for their teens should they need it, what are their opportunities in terms of providing for their kids, and what are the ways in which the teens are able to access space if the financial burden was not as much of a constraint. So in other words, kind of thinking about, well, if these teens are the ones that are of the population that are able to access as many opportunities as possible, they will provide us a picture of the best possibilities in terms of their mobilities and access is concerned. And then also in the literature, a lot of the youth geography and a lot of the studies of marginalized populations like younger people are primarily focused on socioeconomically challenged, which may provide a different set of insights on how our transportation system is functioning. But if our transportation system does not work for those who are the most research rich, then they really don't work for the vast majority of other people. As far as the other aspects is concerned, the race and ethnicity closely mirror those of the county. And then further, as far as the teens that were sampled, we got exactly 50-50 females and males, and a even distribution, about 25% each in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And so we were pretty happy as far as the age and the sex and gender distribution is concerned. So here are some highlights that I'm going to run through relatively quickly, and we kind of divided them in terms of the presentation by the two schools. When we looked at the teens and how many of them are have their driver's license and when they got their driver's license, we found that there were definitely more kids in South Burlington, about a quarter of them, who have their license already versus about 37% at CVU. As far as the age is concerned, we're not seeing the types of delays that's being talked about in the national literature. Literally, the teens that are getting their license are getting it pretty much as soon as they can. And even for those who are too young to get their license, when you ask them when they expect to or when they wish that they will get their license, vast majority of them are saying basically 16 or 17 pretty much as soon as they possibly can. And there's some dynamics there that we've kind of found out later on as far as why some of the teens might be delaying, and that might have more to do with the fact that they have older siblings or kind of sharing of vehicles or staggering that's beyond the control of the teens themselves. Very basic type of question. A lot of the research is focused on adults getting to work. For young people who are of school age, the most important trips that takes up the vast majority of the time and the greatest purpose is getting to and from school. And when we look at the distribution of the travel mode between the two schools, that's where we kind of see some of the bigger differences. We have basically the same proportion of people who are taking either a public bus or a school bus, although in the CVU case, we posit that it's most likely just a school bus. But when you look at the other modes, there's vastly more people who go to South Burlington who are walking and biking, 15% versus just under 2% for CVU. And then when you look at how that's compensated, CVU, there's a lot more people, about 2/3 of the students who are either driving or getting some kind of rides. And that's pretty important to note because we hear a lot about how kids no longer walk or bike to school compared to older generations. And that's definitely true for the CVU types of school where it's extremely difficult because of the distances that are involved. But if you have a school in a land use environment more like South Burlington High, where you have a smaller school district and a greater population, it's a lot easier for kids who would choose to do that to actually walk or bike. And then we asked a number of questions, and we just chose one here as an example. We asked, are there local places that you would like to go but can't get there, or you would have a hard time getting there? Part of the reason why we're doing this is because a lot of the research in this area is based on observations of what people have done. So it's very easy to see the places that teens might have gone, but we wanted an idea of what kind of places that they would like to go but can't, and this is just a broader initial question to a subset of questions about those things. The numbers are kind of close, but we're talking about roughly a fifth of the CVU students who are saying to us that there are things that they like to do or places they would want to go for various reasons that they can't do that. We'll get into some of the details of why, and not all of that is necessarily distance and transportation related. There might be family reasons why that's happening, but it's interesting to kind of note that there are certainly difficulties as far as teens are concerned in terms of places that they can't get to and opportunities that they can access. Okay, so the technology piece, we had these information, these questions about what kind of technologies are available, and the vast majority, as you would expect, from the type of households that we're talking about, these resource-rich households, almost 100% have internet access at home. Almost 100% of the parents have cell phones of their own, and about half of them have smartphones. As far as the teens are concerned, when we're looking at both schools together, almost 90% of these teens, and you got to remember that these are as young as 9th grade, almost 90% of them have cell phones themselves, and of those with cell phones, roughly 40% of them have some kind of smartphone with a data plan. So these are really digitally rich households with teens that are adopting these technologies. And that's kind of important to note. And when we look at the information comparing to the national scene, and this is actually a little bit a Pew survey that's done after ours, so you would think that with adoption rates increasing, what we have as far as our households and our teens is concerned is extremely high adoption rates even compared to the national average. So that's reflective of the types of households that we're talking about here. And when we look at this by school, there are some minor differences between the two schools. As far as having cell phones is concerned, there are definitely more teens in South Burlington High with that. And we later found that, okay, not only are the teens in CVU challenged by these large physical distances, what we've learned from both the surveys and doing the workshops is that there are cell phone coverage issues if you live in a rural area. Some of these teens, there's actually not even good cell phone coverage at CVU, and a lot of these teens live in an area where having a cell phone would actually really not do them any good, because when they're at home or most of the time where they're spending a lot of their time doing activities, they don't have the types of coverage that students at South Burlington might. So that's another layer that we didn't initially consider, but was finally kind of revealed to us. So going deeper into some of the other findings, looking at transportation and the connection with technology, we asked one question about teens, whether they use technology for communications, whether that's email, texting, IM, or other forms of electronic communications in the past week to arrange for transportation. And what we found was that about 35% of them used their various electronic communication channels to arrange for transportation at least once a day. It's slightly higher in South Burlington than you would expect that, because those are the teens, more of them have the cell phones, and there might be more reliance on that. In addition to that, we did some very simple statistical analysis looking at how this variable in terms of how often these teens are using technology to connect with transportation, and see how it correlates with other aspects of their characteristics. And the first one, it's a little bit circular, but if you have a smartphone, it's more likely that you would use it, so that would make sense, because if you have the technology, you would use it. But the other ones, as far as correlating between more using these electronic communications with wanting to spend more time with friends after school, we found that kids that are more active as far as their social activities or their after school activities. They're more likely in terms of having to make arrangements that's other than what their primary mode might be. Females are more likely to be more closely related with arranging for transportation than males do. We found that if you have a larger household size, actually, that there's less of a this kind of arrangement. And we don't want to speculate too much, but it could possibly be due with the fact that if you have siblings or more people who can do these kind of coordination with you and kind of plan ahead, that you might not need to do some of the communications that's necessary. And then interestingly, though, having a curfew or actually having a sibling and kind of seeing if those things are related, they were not statistically significant when we tested for those. And then lastly, we dove into some of the open-ended questions. We asked questions of both the parents. Remember, this is a parent survey. We asked the parents whether they have any kind of curfews or family rules for the kids. And then we asked the teens themselves whether they had any rules that they were supposed to obey. Interestingly, when you asked the parents, about 3/4 of them said that there were some kind of family rules or curfews. But when you asked the teens, less than half of them said that they had some kind of family rules. So there might be a mismatch between what they see as rules and curfews and the types of negotiation that goes on, maybe revealing that the intra-household negotiation is something that is not as transparent or obvious to both parties or the different parties within the households. And then taking some quotes from the parents survey primarily, we get to see some of the reasons why there are, or what some of these family rules or curfews might be. A lot of parents made references to having an agreement where they may not have a specific set of rules, but that if they go somewhere, that they have to communicate it in advance, and that's when they are, out somewhere, that they have to be in contact. This next one refers to that they need to text us before leaving and when arriving at places, especially when driving herself. So this idea that it's not so much that there's a boundary of where you can and cannot go, but it's just that you have to tell me in advance and tell me when you get there. And then lastly, this idea that there's, if I call you or if I text you, you better be responding within a reasonable amount of time. And we kind of think of this as this virtual tether, that we use these cell phones and other technologies as a way to keep track of where family members are, and for parents to really kind of note, okay, I'm not going to really tell you where not to go or where to go maybe, but that this idea that I want to be in touch with you at all times, that whatever you're doing, I want to be able to get a hold of you. And that's very different than previous generations when this technology was not necessarily available. And then as far as the previous research is concerned, there's a lot of other research that has shown that there are differences between boys and girls as far as geographic extent is concerned, especially when there's not this virtual tether. Other research have shown that girls would have to come home earlier or can't go as far, whereas boys have been found to be able to go further from their homes, maybe when they're, and even stay out a little bit longer. What we found in here is that we don't know if it's because of this virtual tether, but we didn't find that there are necessarily differences between boys and girls as far as places that they can or cannot go. And much of that depends much more on the age factor. And the age factor can be related to a number of things, including whether they have the ability to get places, like whether they have their driver's license or not, and also maybe with their maturity level. And so this adoption of the technology may be leading to some kind of equality or closer to equality between how parents are treating boys and girls. And that's a line of research that I think would be kind of different. And then the last point that I think is that a lot of the older kids, what the parents are saying is that there's not necessarily rigid rules, but that it may be very well done on a case-by-case basis, that you let me know and I'll tell you whether that's a go or no-go. And so this idea of independence with mobility and how teens are achieving that is very interesting, leading us on to a number of other questions that are of interest to us. So I'm going to pass on to Meghan now to the second part of the research.
Okay, partly as a way to kind of flesh out some of the findings that we were discovering in the survey data, but also as a way to very much frame this in terms of youth perspectives and really trying to dig into how did teens see their own lives, not just how did we, as particularly me as now having a teen of my own in my household, not just our perceptions from a different generation and in a sort of researcher kind of mode. So we held a half-day workshop and invited all the teens who had expressed interest in following up with the research. And we got 5 teens to agree to come along and spend the morning with us one weekend. And we used a couple of different sort of techniques that I had developed in previous research, as well as one new one that I'll tell you about in a moment. So first of all, we definitely used a very basic method of group discussion. So basically kind of a focus group and trying to understand what were the typical destinations, where did people go, what did they see as major barriers or opportunities in their transportation and so forth. We also put some of the mapping opportunities to work. So we had both a computer mapping exercise, which used Google Maps for the students to actually go in and annotate where their a couple of key places were, places that they wanted to go. We showed them very quickly how to draw routes on Google Maps and also to add text. So they added comments about different, even like small road segments. There was one connector. They really wish there was a connector between this street and that street in South Burlington. And so there was quite a fine level of detail on their computer maps. And so they did that individually, kind of rotating through. And so we had a map generated from each of those 5 teens. We also had a paper mapping exercise, which was a little more collective. So that was a bit more cooperative between the teens who were doing it. They kind of did it in pairs and overlapped a little bit. And so in this photo, 2 of the girls from South Burlington who didn't really know each other, but they were kind of agreeing, like, oh yeah, that place too. And so that was important as a sort of as getting a sense of sort of the cumulative youth knowledge about these different towns. It worked probably best in South Burlington because we had sort of a few people from South Burlington, whereas the other towns, there was very low representation from each one of those. But it was good because we, again, we had like sticky dots and highlighters and markers, and there's something about putting a big map on a table and inviting people to draw on them with markers and sticky notes and all those kinds of things that really gets people going. And so we had a lot of really rich context that was added there. The students wrote a lot of material on, quite small Post-its and posted them all over each other, and it was quite an excavation to peel those off, those layers, and digitize them later. So those were really valuable methodologies as far as trying, again, to dig into the deeper, the kind of process-oriented elements of our research. The last method that we used that was designed solely for this project, and we're hoping to talk a little bit more about in a publication that we're working on, is what we called text review. So we had come to this realization that the phone was a really important part of negotiating daily spaces and figuring out a ride or staying in touch with parents or whatever it was. So we wondered how we could get some kind of accounting for that. But we didn't want to touch their phones. We didn't want to know anything beyond the boundaries of what they felt comfortable sharing. So we developed a technique where basically the student sat with their own phone and scrolled through whatever, if it was, texting or Facebook messaging or whatever, and identified a few instances in which they arranged some kind of either hitching up with friends or getting a ride from someone, some kind of coordination that needed to happen. And then they traced it back to see where did this originate. And we, as you can see, Brian diligently typing as fast as he could to account for what the teens were telling us. So this is an important, for those of you who are thinking about research methods, it was actually quite successful in the sense that, first of all, the Institutional Review Board gave us permission to do it, which I'm not sure they would have if we had said we were going to download all the texts that the teens had ever sent. And then another consideration is that we really empowered the teens to tell us what they felt comfortable sharing. And one of our, when we presented this, some of the rudimentary pieces of this research at our national meetings last year, a colleague of ours who was the discussant for that session said that we were allowing the teens to curate their own digital experience. And I really like that idea of curating because it really does put the teen in, really in control of what we heard about. And indeed, what we found was a lot of coordination of daily lives going on through those methods of communication. Okay, so then here we were with a lot of survey data, some qualitative data, which was not a lot of people, but it was very rich. And we needed a way to start to analyze it. Obviously, we could do statistical analysis. We could do some more work on the survey data, and we are working on that. But we also wanted a way to kind of pull together these multiple data sources and start to build some insights. So I'm going to take you through, this was, again, a little bit experimental. It was an analysis technique that we ended up calling vignettes. So essentially what we did was we pulled together a bunch of data sources based on each of the 5 teens that were in the workshop and kind of reproduced a story based on what they told us from both the survey data, their parents' survey data, and what they told us in the workshop. So here's an example, and I know this is really long and intimidating. I'm just going to read it to you so you don't have to strain yourself. But this is the kind of thing that we generated, and we use this as an analysis technique because it started to reveal some of the themes that we were really interested in. So Ramani, which is not her real name, is a junior, age 17, lives in South Burlington with her parents, grandmother, and 14-year-old sister. She's a heavy user of her phone, which is tied to both her busy and extracurricular schedule full of high-performing activities, and the fact she needs to negotiate to use her mother's car on a daily basis. Regarding technology and communications in general, Ramani mostly texts or uses Facebook messaging. For transportation, she usually texts and sometimes calls, but when her phone is broken, she relies on Facebook push notifications on the computer. She also uses Facebook for a few particular friends who don't use their phones as much. Facebook is useful for events that are farther out in time or with friends from other schools. As events become closer, she switches to text, then calls if necessary. Ramani uses group texting to make arrangements with friends. She uses email primarily with teachers, parents, and other adults. And 2 of the 6 texts that she reviewed with us were group texts to organize for a group of people to get somewhere. 4 of the texts were with peers, and of those, 3 were follow-ups from conversations in school hallways. 4 of the 6 texts involved Ramani looking for a ride somewhere, with 1 additional text involving organizing an event at her own home. Okay, so this is like this compilation of a whole bunch of different sources of data. And so then what we did was we highlighted the things that were especially relevant. So here, all in blue, is the things that involved communication. So this is how we actually started to build out some of the themes of what kinds of things were most relevant for communication. And then in yellow, or orange, depending on your perspective, the kinds of events or goals that needed to happen, right? To negotiate to use your mother's car, for transportation, events, arrangements, and so forth. So this is just a kind of a quick example of the kind of analysis that we do. And I know there's a lot of students in the audience, so I want to just kind of flag that as an important skill, but also an important method to build these kinds of insights from a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. So let me see what's next. Okay, so now things get a little crazy because we're going to jointly kind of pull everything together for you. We're going to discuss some of the emerging insights that are coming out of here, and then I think frame it in terms of why Vermont is useful as a research context.
So we'll just kind of go back and forth between kind of bringing back the research questions that we had asked in the beginning and some of the insights that we're able to provide you. If you recall, the first question was concerning the impacts of land use and transportation and land use planning and decisions on young people. There are a number of things that we found, but we thought that the most important thing was that there's a variety of opportunities and they're differentiated by age and location. And by location, we're really talking about the densities of opportunities, the spatial distribution of these opportunities, and then the fabric of the transportation network that connects these opportunities. The connectivity for the different modes and how people are able to get to things are very important. And those come in different layers depending on the ages and depending their abilities to navigate that system. So we thought that that was a pretty important thing.
Okay, and then moving to our second research question, how do young people move around, navigate, and access spaces in daily lives? One of the emerging insights that we're finding is that indeed, partly because it is quite a resource-rich context, many teens have very high levels of independent mobility. That is, they're able to go places they want to, though that is often tempered by household negotiations and family rules. And then the last research question is, how has the rise of instant mobile communication technologies shifted the ways that young people organize and live their daily and digital lives? So here, I think what we're starting to find is that this notion of digital lives is quite helpful in trying to understand not just the transportation network and land use in terms of adult views of what is efficient or it doesn't cost too much money or is convenient for adults, but really kind of shifting the focus to thinking about what is the kind of youth perspective that can be useful in this, and what is it that matters for teens in terms of these kinds of negotiations.
And to add to that, it's evident from the vignette that the teens use a lot of different forms of communications. In fact, I would argue that we all do. But it was very interesting to kind of think about, contrary to the popular beliefs in the discourse that, teens are not just focused on text messaging. They might be doing a lot of that, but there are different layers of communications, and they use that in differentiated ways. It depends on the audience that they're talking to. Some of the teens talked about how, I talk to older people, people in their 20s, my older brothers, or their parents, then I have to email them, or that there's differentiation between the urgency and the timeline. They might start off a conversation in Facebook to try to organize an event. When it's getting closer to the day off and they really need to get a hold of people, that they may switch to text messaging. And then when it's the day of the event and maybe just within an hour something happening and you really need to confirm or get something, that you might switch to heaven forbid, calling someone and actually getting that voice connection. So there's this almost hierarchy that we saw in terms of the types of communication tools that's used, depending on the audience and depending on the purpose and the timeline that we're talking about.
Okay, so to kind of wrap it up and talk a little bit about some broader implications, we feel that this research really demonstrates the importance of paying attention to context. So context in this case, in a very tangible sense, rested on land use and transportation patterns. But I think we also have to, of course, acknowledge the context of Vermont. Right? So some of our questions that we didn't talk about much today are things about issues of seasonality, for instance. And we did indeed have teens talk about, oh, well, when it's raining, I do this, or when it's snowing, I do that. And so that definitely, the sort of weather context was an important element. The quite rural character of Shelburne and Charlotte in particular. Two of our teens who participated in the workshop were from Charlotte. And so a lot of the constraints that they were talking about, having no cell coverage, they weren't driving yet, there was actually twin boys. They did a lot of sports and involved a lot of travel. Their sense of space was very bizarre. They told us, it would take 10 hours to get to Massachusetts and things like that. And so, their world was really constricted in some very particular ways. It's not as unique to Vermont, but I think it gives us a range of insights about these different contexts that we're looking at. It also, this research, I think, helps us make these specific connections between that context and the different forms of mobility that might be most relevant. So in our case, looking at teens, and really trying to identify the ways that teens who are very oriented towards social-based opportunities and the sort of multiple destinations that they would like to go to, how that influences the kinds of activities they get to engage with, the kinds of modes of travel they use, and again, going back to those household negotiations. So I just mention quickly that Romani, who we showed you the vignette for, she would get up really early in order to drive her mother to work so that she could then have the car that day so that she could get to her violin lesson in Essex or whatever it was. So that was a very typical pattern for her, and that was a set of physical, social constraints, mobility questions, household negotiations, and so forth. So I think that kind of helps us open up some of these issues. The third insight or implication I think that we really have to consider is, particularly from my background in youth geography, is I've always been very much interested in advocating for youth participation in decision making. At municipal levels, at local and regional levels, and I think that this kind of work can really help to reveal some of the key issues that teens face. And I think it would be really fantastic to have a broader participation of teens in those kinds of decision-making functions so that we don't design places that are really spatially isolating or that are really difficult to get around in. Okay, and I'll turn that to you.
Yeah, and what I'll add is that the last thing is this idea that there's a connection between schools and transportation, especially in light of a lot of the conversations that we're having in this state regarding school consolidations and what can we do about our education system. A lot of the conversations have been involved with that, if you have larger schools and larger school districts, there might be more opportunities that are created because you can sustain a music program as well as sports program versus a bunch of little schools. But what's not really talked about is the transportation aspect and who's shouldering the costs of that. And those costs are real monetary costs, as well as the time, kind of the opportunity costs, really, that if kids are not able to get to school and actually do a lot of the after-school activities themselves, would they be able to participate in those programs that are offered? And if they're not able to navigate and get to schools themselves, how much of that cost is shouldered onto the parents even though the school district might not have to think about some of that transportation cost, but the additional cost for parents to either pay for gas or even buy an additional vehicle, those are real costs for the people living here. And that's not the conversation that we're having. But we do think that the transportation part is a really important part that should be involved when we're talking about changes to our school systems and how we offer education to our kids. And so with that, that's the end, and we want to thank you for staying in this really warm room.
And I have no idea what time it is, but I think we can probably take a couple questions, right?
Questions or comments?
Comments? Yeah.
So how did you account for bias in the distribution of your survey?
How do we account for bias? Bias of what? Because some of the main thing that we did account for example, we got pretty close distribution between the two schools in terms of how many people were from the two schools, and we got almost exactly 50-50 boys and girls, and really good distribution as far as each of the grades are concerned. So we didn't actually take additional steps other than checking, comparing the two schools, and also checking, comparing to the population of the county. So as far as the race and ethnicity is concerned, and that was pretty close, but it was really the income part that really had us concerned. And we didn't end up doing anything to account for that, except to kind of not think about this as something that we can generalize, but taking a slice of the population, that thinking that the findings that we have is for the resource-rich part of the population.
So were there any incentives to fill out your survey?
Yeah, we actually we raffled off an iPad. And so we thought that that was the currency of the day a couple of years ago, and it was popular enough, but apparently it wasn't, that popular that it got us more. Yeah.
So you guys talked about organization of digital lives for the teens, and I have two teens myself, and I find them highly disorganized people, or they're organizing their lives in basically real time with their technology. Did you see a lot of that?
Yeah, definitely. So the question is about organizing. We use the term organizing your lives, and yet apparently there are some teens who are disorganized. And I think, for one thing, I think using that term organizing their lives is not necessarily that their lives are organized, but rather that there are a series of decisions and connections and contacts that you need to make in order just to kind of get through the day. And I think you're right that the technology has allowed us to compress that to the very last moment possible. And so it may be partly that to our grown-up eyes that that seems very disorganized. And I think that would be a great question for teens. Like, how organized do you think your life is? From the perspective of some of the teens who were in our workshop, they seemed to know a lot about what they needed to do, where they needed to go, how they could get access to different resources, or things like rides, or borrowing a car, and also responsibilities. So one of the teens, one of the girls had to drive her younger brother to hockey practice. That was the price of her getting a car, was that she had to ferry her younger brother around. And her single mom also spoke of this in the survey, saying this really helped me out because then I didn't have to do all the after-school driving. So I think that, if we take it loosely, indeed, teens are organizing their lives. It may not always seem that way to parents, but I think that they are using these technologies in very specific ways to coordinate. Maybe that's a better word, to coordinate their lives.
Yeah,
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Indicative of how organized or disorganized some of these teens might be. The people that showed up at the workshop had very busy and they're highly functioning teens. And we had more people that said that they would come, but then let us know at the last minute that they couldn't come, right? But what we did reveal from these even really highly functioning teens was that they did do things last minute, but there was a connection to something that was a little bit more distant in time. Their organization might be grounded in seeing each other, passing each other in the halls and say, oh, let's do something this Friday. And that was their kind of the genesis of doing something. And there's still this value of the FaceTime starting something, or that they might be chatting with someone, or they talked about playing Xbox. And at first, Meghan and I didn't realize that, in these consoles, you can chat with each other and talk in real time. And they talk about, oh, let's try to do this later on, and then we'll connect on it later. Whether how many of those ideas actually come to fruition, we don't know. But there's a connection between some of these other spaces and ways of communicating to the actual last-minuteness in terms of them executing it. Yeah.
You looked at this in your study, but is there a connection between higher mobility rates and performance in the classroom?
So the question was whether there was any connection with higher mobility rates and performance in the classrooms. We don't have any of that information. We didn't ask for it, but we do have colleagues out at UC Davis that has done I went into high school with a shorter version of surveys and have not exactly performance, but have indicators of how content they are or how well that they think that they might be doing. So there could be work that will look into something like that.
Yeah, I had a question about when talking about action and like policy, which you mentioned towards the end. Like if you noticed any steps being taken by either any of the counties in terms of how they incorporate teen youth voice in terms of policy or anything like that. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about, is there evidence of incorporating youth voices into decision-making processes? And the answer is yes, there is. Unfortunately, the U.S. tends to be way behind. There is quite a movement toward things called like youth councils, and this is quite common in Europe. And actually quite a lot of the developing world has designated youth councils at local and regional levels where young people will come together and there will be, a sort of semi-structured workshop, sort of like what we had, where there might be a mapping exercise, there might be a sort of brainstorming kind of thing and so forth. That it has, to varying degrees been used to inform policy measures. For various reasons, I think the U.S. is somewhat behind on that. One reason is that this is kind of a multi-step process, but the U.S. hasn't ratified the United Nations Rights of the Child, along with Somalia. So actually, the reason that matters is that there is a United Nations child-friendly cities movement. And so any country that's signed on to the rights of the child has access to a lot of resources to make places, cities and towns, more youth and child-friendly, which includes things like infrastructure and youth councils and other forms of outreach and inclusion. And those resources are not available in the U.S. So I think that's one among many reasons. But I would love to see an expansion of that. And I think that it wouldn't take all that much work for things like planning commissions and select boards in Vermont to reach out to young people. And I think one of the key things, though, I'll just say, I'll put a plug in for the young people who are not the top of the class, right? It's a lot of times, it's sort of like the best students are the ones that get picked to go and talk to the select board. And I would love to see a diversity of kids who get to talk to the select board, not just that sort of token valedictorian. And so, to the extent that you all can help make that happen, I think it would be fantastic. Yeah.
First, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Luke Reed. I'm from a group called Sustainable Williston, and one of the things we're working on is trying to facilitate more sustainable transportation opportunities to and from CVU. So there have been groups working on this, towns, CVU itself, community groups in Heinsberg and Charlotte and Williston, and I'm trying to connect some of these groups. So if you're somebody who's interested in getting your hands dirty and trying to work on specifically sustainability-oriented solutions for CVU, come get in touch with me. I'll get your email down and keep you in the loop. And then I had a question as well.
Okay, let me just say that if anybody wants to get in touch with Luke, this is Luke Reed. You can also, my email's right there, and if you want to jot that down fast, I'm on the listserv for Sustainable Williston and on the Planning Commission of Williston, and I have done a youth task force. So I'm happy to connect that as well. And then you had a question.
Yeah, and so my question was about, and you touched on this at several points, so I don't know if there's further information on this, but I'm curious about the drivers for transportation choices and whether you got insight into what caused a particular family to choose to drive rather than use the bus or take a bike.
Yeah, so we did reveal a few things. First of all, there was a fairly high level of parents who, in our survey, we did ask, have you bought an additional vehicle for your licensed teen? And quite a high number said yes. I can't remember what was the proportion for that off the top of my head. So we did ask about that. We asked about local infrastructure. I think part of what you're asking about, there's what's available, and then there's also the choices that people make. And one thing that we learned from the teens is that the school bus is not favored. In fact, we heard a new term for it, which is the shame train. And so we kind of were like, wow, the school bus, which is an economically and ecologically efficient mode of transportation, is called the shame train, and anyone who can is avoiding that by either pressuring or taking advantage of a parental offer of a car. And so I think that there, could be some, I would love to see, school buses kind of envisioned as a green option, rather than as the shame train. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of different pressures on families. There's time and busyness and all those things. And a lot of those choices are made probably spur of the moment. And yet, I think there are also steps that could be taken to improve the sort of efficiency. There are lots of traffic problems around CVU. If you've been traveling toward Heinsberg on any school morning, there are student deaths that have happened, pretty high-profile crashes. There was a kid from Shelburne killed on the way to school just about a year ago. And so there are definitely costs to high levels of driving. And school buses are safe. They have a lower, carbon footprint per student, and yet they've been really heavily stigmatized. So I think there's some work to be done there.
Oh, so I forgot to mention, we're also trying to work with UVM students themselves.
Okay.
They've got a great environmental action.
Okay.
The school bus is the shame train. Did you see any students taking other public transportation, just taking the bus?
Well, the South Burlington students, they have the ability to ride the bus basically free to them. So we did see that in the survey, and as well from the workshop, that they did talk about taking the public bus. I think there's a knowledge component. You may realize that there is a bus, but you may not know where it goes, and there's a level of proficiency in terms of trying to understand, how to kind of navigate that. I think it's definitely more encouraged in South Burlington because they do have this model where their students are basically given the access for free to this service.
I just want to mention quick, too, that one of the students who did our workshop was a really interesting case because she lived in Shelburne, but she very consciously rejected both technology and cars. So she had a license, she had a car available to her if she wanted it, And she had a cell phone, but she would leave her cell phone at home kind of on purpose, and she confessed that she didn't really like to drive. And then she said, well, actually, I just feel guilty about driving, and I go and I take the public bus from Shelburne all the way into Burlington when I want to go. So she was kind of an interesting case because she was really trying to consciously buck the trend. And I thought that was quite a nice compliment to some of the other stuff that we were hearing.
Are there any plans to further this research, and like what would the next steps be in furthering the study?
Do you want to go?
Sure. I mean, we're writing proposals to look at different aspects of this. I think it would be interesting to do a more comprehensive and bigger sample of surveys so that we could actually do some of the quantitative analysis, for example. From the qualitative work and from the workshop, it led us into a number of themes relating to technology, which was something that we didn't really focus on or kind of thought about when we first envisioned this. So, we've talked about how to develop research that is more of a focus on the technology part. And in fact, when we got the first results, our colleagues in Davis were about to roll out this pretty big survey into the Bay Area into 9 different high schools, and I got her to insert a number of questions on technology. So one of these days I'll get around to kind of getting back to her about kind of analyzing that data and looking at a different part of the world, different part of the country, and then how teens are there as far as technology and transportation is concerned. So there's already, ideas that will be more easily executed than other ones that might be further down the line, depending on, what opportunities that we can create.
Yeah, and I would just say I think this is definitely very much a pilot study, and I think we were very exploratory and trying to figure out what are some of these important themes to follow up on, and we would love to do more, more in depth and build on our present insights.
So that seems like a perfect place to stop. I'm sure Brian and Megan will stick around if anybody has any questions. Thank you guys for coming. And
Thank you.